So welcome to XR and Ethics, a survey of ethical engagement practices in action. I'll hand it off to Evo here in a sec, brought to you by the XR Guild. This panel is a cross-section of AR and XR teams using a mix of technologies for immersive play, immediate information, real-time training, and augmentation of the workforce. Whether the use cases are public or private, the inquiries we engage when creating new AR and XR experiences are quite similar. There's a number of questions that this group will work through in their panel. This panel will feature some of the specialists and speakers from the board and leadership of XR Guild, subject to their availability. Evo will moderate this panel with a diverse mix of AR, XR voices contributing. I'll let her take it from here to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for those of you who are joining us. This is going to be a relatively informal conversation, so if you want to come closer to the audience, we're going to be in inquiry together. Don't feel like you have to, but we want to be able to see your faces and engage with you. There will be some time for Q&A as we get going. So, as Laura said, my name is Evo Heyning. I am the board vice president of xrguild.org. XR Guild is a nonprofit organization designed specifically for all of you, for the creators, the industry makers, those of you who have built this industry over the last few decades. And we are here to talk a little bit about what that process looks like, and I'd love to introduce you to our amazing speaker panelists today. So to my right, first we have Damon Hernandez. Damon focuses on immersive web and the built environment. He is relocated from our area now to Finland and is working in Europe. And we next have Dana Ware, and Dana focuses on location-based experiences in AR. She recently was working prior to the pandemic with the Void and VR and has now moved to be the CCO of Around and focusing on AR in LBEs. And finally, Aaron Pulkka. Aaron is the AR/VR director at Amber. All of these amazing speakers are also XR Guild active members, board members, or are engaged in different programs with us as well. Aaron specifically focuses on both enterprise and entertainment and thinking about the consumer experience. So if you've seen Amber's work in AR and VR, Aaron is the one to thank for that. And we're going to be in a conversation that's a bit of an inquiry together because most of us have been in this industry for a long time. I see some familiar faces in the room. I know many of you have been hitting your various walls over our technology peaks and flows. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the questions we hold together, how we do that. For those of you who were here last year, XR Guild had a long list with Avi and a great group of panelists about how we engage in ethics, forming an ethical framework for our industry. And that led to many great conversations. It's led to some audio and video that has led to a number of programmatic things that we're doing with the Guild. Just to speak to those very briefly, if you go to xrguild.org, you can find, for example, a letter that is currently in development. Co-signers for that letter are welcome. Avi spoke to that in day one of AWE, specifically around safety and our role together to create safer experiences, whether we're in AR, VR, XR, and certainly out in public. And other projects that you can participate in. We're going to talk a little bit today about the Guild Library. I see Julian Reyes in the room, and he is one of our colleagues who is going to be contributing in the library respect. Damon and I have been working on design of an immersive web Guild library for our industry. And what that looks like is many of us have been a part of research and development over the last 25 years that has been lost to a black box or a corporate vault that will never see the light of day again. How do we find the best resources, research, interviews, all of the content that all of us have created together when it's so fragmented? So creating a research and development library for our industry also creates a safe place. So the Guild, which Damon and I have been working on with an amazing architect, will be a 3D web space for all of you to come and be in inquiry or development or in research together as well. So as a nonprofit, we are very we're trying to find the right answers to these questions. And I would love for each of you to speak to maybe 5 minutes of what you do and maybe why you do it, and then why XR Guild? Why did you find that XR Guild was a part of your work?
And
Yes, go ahead.
so I guess I'll start off. So with that, as Evo shared, my focus has been on the built environment and really enterprise. So I've been in the Web 3D and immersive technology space for now 23 years. And I stand on the shoulders of giants, as I say, but a lot of them actually are here. I get to call them friends. And so for me, it's always been less focus on humans, to be quite honest. It was more on utility. How are we solving big problems in a variety of different industries? Or now I deal a lot with digital twins up to kind of like digital city scale. But, and as a person who is a very basic developer of I call myself a hobbyist, but lead teams that are actually, we develop these things. I don't know what I don't know, right? I mean, we've developed these solutions, and we've always kind of looked at, first, and this is, my fault, but we were looking at how do you solve the problem, right? And then somewhere you kind of throw in the user experience, UI, how do we make it good? But it wasn't until really I sat down with someone who said, well, hey, are you building things ethically? And I was like, well, yeah, of course I am, because it's not like we're sitting down saying, how can we build this unethical application? But then when they kind of shared with me some things to consider and considerations and kind of went through this checklist, I realized, oh, wow, actually this has not been at the front of my mind as much as it should be in doing this. It's not a pillar, right? Embarrassingly, it was kind of like something that I just assumed was thrown in there. And embarrassing enough to say that the user experience was an afterthought. So for me, when I saw that the XR Guild was launching, and then kind of coming to this realization at the same time, as Eva mentioned, being in Finland, really trying to understand it's so ingrained in their culture of humanity and start with the human first. And I'm sorry, as an American, I love my country, but that is not how we operate here. So kind of looking at these two things of how do we start with the human, and then how do we really make ethics a pillar in what we do, is why as a new person to seeing the importance of this, as I'd like to say, is why I'm involved, is to be able to go to peers, people that have been in the industry long enough to have tried these things, and then for me, it's to get best practices and learn to make better products and better company, and a better experience at the end of the day for the human.
Wow. Dana, I'm going to let you.
Yeah. So I started in location-based VR, working with companies that are like these massive studios, right? So Disney, Sony, these studios that have these like huge brand recognition, and are specific to developing content that is family-friendly as well, right? Disney, very family-friendly. So that was like the first time working in the VR space where we were trying to define what does it mean to have these like immersive experiences that you want anyone who's a child, all the way up through generations to be able to go in together and have a really good experience, but also knowing that you are going to be collecting their information while you're doing that, right? And knowing that you are taking, I literally am taking your physical safety into my hands and blindfolding you while I send you into a place that could be potentially very dangerous, right? And so there's a lot of these ethical questions that you don't really think of when you're kind of looking at it more from like an industry perspective of like, I'm just making a product and I'm pushing it out into the world. Until you start having to reanalyze how are people going to engage with this product and what is the best way for me to make sure that no one is injured while they're doing that, right? So that was kind of when ethics really first in this space became an issue for me, recognizing, because I came from film before that. And in film, part of my undergrad degree at UCLA was like, it was mixed. And I did like ethnographic studies as part of it, as well as like film education and new media stuff. But it was always like, whatever I show you on the screen needs to be ethical. However I go about my measures of gathering my data or like whatever story I'm telling, that should be ethical. It never came back to this physical person that I'm now asking to engage in a physical activity. That also now needs to be ethical. So looking at it in these different frames, for me, started to become this eye-opening experience where I realized like there aren't standards. And we are having to define those as we go. And so when you get into a community where people are engaged in these conversations with each other, you start to be able to really feel more confident in some of these choices that you're making because there aren't guidelines that are set out yet. So that's kind of where it kind of started in my journey of trying to understand what does ethics mean within this space. But it now, as I'm working in the AR space, and that has a whole nother connotation of privacy issues associated with it. And when I was coming on to this new company at Around, one of my first questions before I even joined the company was I wanted to know, how do you protect privacy issues, data, personal information? Because we're accessing your camera, but we're also accessing different types of data points of where your location is. So all these kinds of things that we kind of take for granted as creators and don't sometimes recognize what that can truly mean for the user if it's not done correctly. And when you're partnering with different companies, it's also thinking about how do you define what is important to you in that partnership when you're working with stakeholders as well. So lots of questions, lots of different things kind of going on, but it's nice to have a community where you can talk about this and start to kind of come to some type of feeling of assurance while you're doing it so that you're not alone in the process.
Interactivity adds quite a bit of risk, and it changes the way we are in dialogue. And Erin, maybe you can speak to how you do your work in XR Guild, but also a bit about how this plays out in your own work.
Absolutely. I started working in XR about 30 years ago at the Human Interface Technology Lab at the University of Washington. Dr. Tom Furness was my graduate advisor, and he had come from doing AR and VR work in the Air Force. And one of the things that he said when he came to the university is he was beating his sword into a plowshare and taking that technology and using it for good. And that was sort of instilled in everything we did in the HIT lab, is making sure that we were focused on how are we using this technology to make people's lives better and to make communities better. And so that helped kind of provide that foundation initially. But then going to Walt Disney Imagineering and working in things for kids and families, it was very much ingrained in everything we did there that we had to think about how that impacted the people that are coming through our space. And so I think that helped provide that foundation. And over the years, I've worked on a lot of location-based entertainment and consumer entertainment products, whether it's XR or traditional video games. And those considerations aren't always taken into, or they aren't always taken into consideration. So that's can be a problem. And so over time, as I worked like at 2-Bit Circus, we had ingrained in us a very strong set of ethical considerations around animals, because circuses have a bad reputation and a bad history with the treatment of animals. So even in our virtual portrayal of animals, that was important to us. So those were things, because we were creating our own product, we were curating our own space. Those were things that we had control over and could take command of. In my current work, I work at Amber, which is a work-for-hire company, primarily providing game services or game development services to create products. But within my group, focused on AR and VR and other emerging tech products, we are client-driven. And so in that case, we can't just rely on our own perception of what we think we should be working on. We have clients coming to us and asking for things, and they may or may not have already considered some of the implications of what they're asking us to build. And so then it's very important for us, from the very beginning of the user journey, when everybody starts to say, okay, this is the audience that we're building this for, this is the target audience, and then we go from there to spec out what it is we're going to build. It's very important from that very first moment to not get too hyper-focused on the target audience, as marketing often will drive towards a very specific, very narrow-focused audience member and not necessarily consider all of the other people that are going to be impacted by the product that might not be so easily cookie-cuttered. And there's a lot of implications in terms of camera use and privacy that also might not be at the forefront of a client's mind, but it is important to them, because there's liability issues when some of these things do become regulated, and there's laws around these things. that can be an issue. But even before that happens, because those tend to lag, there can be PR nightmares for companies if they don't consider these things. So they're not only like important from a human perspective and being a good person and building products that make the world a better place, there's also liability issues that should be considered. And so what we can help from the very beginning, working with clients to make sure that they're thinking about that every step of the way. And that's both beholden on us as service providers, but it's also beholden on everybody on the team, including the client themselves, to think about those from the very beginning.
In some of the other talks you've seen this week, this concept of starting with ethical design and development from the very first meeting, instead of thinking about ethics as a checklist to deal with at the end, is vital to having reduced the risk for the end user and the community while amplifying, hopefully, the beneficial good parts of interactivity, the joy, the play, right? So when we're thinking about creating a language of ethical design and development, that often means going to stakeholders, maybe a city or a client, and having a tough conversation in the conference room. I'm curious, how do you start that conversation? And are there specific touch points that you give to your other stakeholders as we're thinking about inquiry and how to hold these big questions together to humanize and to make this more accessible for everyone? Anyone else jump in?
I can jump in and just say from the very beginning, it's important, first of all, in the team makeup, to make sure that the team that's having these discussions has a diverse set of perspectives, so that we're not missing some of those big questions. And then it just comes down to raising each of these things that come to mind, and providing that space that people can raise that without fear of being shot down or being seen as negative. And a lot of that has to do with making sure that what we're doing is identifying risks, but also immediately providing solutions. Like this is how we can address this issue. This is something that we can tackle. We've talked a lot in the past about avoiding having those red flags that say, look, we just can't do this, because that just shuts down the conversation. People aren't looking for solutions at that point. They're looking for a way around what you're saying instead of working through it and finding a solution together.
Yeah, I would also say to that degree, like the first part of that too is also like having established like a good culture, right, within your team, but then also hopefully you can start to establish like a good relationship with a client if you're working with a client, so that you can have that open dialogue and not feel like you're going to be completely, shot down or in fear of even bringing the question up or the concern up. And I find, myself, like typically I'm the only female in the room. Typically, I am Latina. I don't look it very much, but yes, I am. So I come at things a little bit differently. I see things a little bit differently. So I am grateful that I get to even be in that conversation and be a part of that room, and have those conversations. But it's also, for myself, sometimes I need to make sure that I'm in a safe space before I even bring up my concerns, because my viewpoint is sometimes different than everybody else that's sitting there, which hopefully they want that. Hopefully that's like embraced, and I do my best work when I'm in a culture that does embrace that and does appreciate that. So trying to get to a place where you can first even be safe enough to have that conversation, I think is the first part. And then the second part of that is sometimes you need to, I've come to realize over the years, if I'm working with people who, one, I don't know quite well yet, or two, like there's a personality I know that's just not going to be receptive to this, is bringing some type of data to the table with me that can help support the case that I'm making in that moment. Sometimes that's finding an ally that is in a different organization. I have a friend that runs Black in Gaming, and so if I come across some types of issues or things that I need some type of just support or just a question, it could be simple as like, how do you feel when you see this thing, like this character or whatever it is? It's so that you have somewhere you can go and ask, and then make sure that you're bringing in an educated kind of concern or thought and solution too, right? So it's the question, it's getting the support that you need, and then also having a solution to that problem. I think you have to be prepared before you go into the conversation, because sometimes people just, like, going back to, like, you don't know if you don't know, sometimes people just don't realize that what they're putting out could potentially be unethical. So you just have to be able to be prepared for that conversation from any angle that it comes up to be, you know.
And I was just going to add, I think that help where the XR Guild can really help, to have that community. If there people aren't on the team already that can provide those perspectives, you have a group that you can come to and have those conversations through either the mentorship program or just the community itself, just being able to reach out and say, does anybody know how to deal with this issue? Does anybody have any solutions or any data to provide that we can help to make this argument about why we want to avoid this particular issue? Because again, if you wait until the very end, it's very expensive to make changes at that point. It can be very difficult from a momentum perspective to make changes. And in many cases, they will have to be made. And so it's far better to make those decisions early.
Also, to that point too, it's also, once you put something out into the world, and if it doesn't represent you or the client ethically, it's really hard to, like, backtrack on that and pull back some of that publication of whatever happens, right? And so there are legitimate financial concerns and potentially reputation concerns that can come up if you're not designing from the beginning in an ethical way. So
Right.
it can save you headache.
Interactivity can include exponential risk, especially in public spaces, with AR, which is a society-shaping technology. And some of us are doing delicate work with governments or with agencies, with people that are front-facing but maybe are vulnerable populations. And privacy is a big concern, right? Which data gets leaked to which organizations can put someone at risk, right? So when you're thinking about the exponential risks and the privacy risks, are there specific touch points that you go to be able to say, here's something I know works, or here's a way we can engage that conversation together, an inquiry space that we can start from so that we can find a way through? How do you engage that conversation?
Well, again, in my ignorance of the proper way to do it before the XR Guild existed, I think it was more of really scaring people into, hey, if you don't think this way, here's all the legal liability that can come afterwards, right? So unfortunately, it wasn't the reward, it was more of, this is the punishment you will get.
The pain.
The pain, because we remember as humans better the pain than the pleasure. You can remember the 5 painful points in your life much faster than I can say what are the 5 happiest. That would take you a moment, right?
Right.
And so I think for me in the past, not having a resource to be able to go to and kind of do this, it was saying, hey, you need to consider these things about the people that are using this or what this does. Otherwise, essentially, especially the litigious nature of this nation, you can get sued, or this can come back, or this is an issue here. And then now what's nice is that I'm seeing the need to evolve again, not just with the XR Guild, but I kind of cheated, right? Because I went to Finland. And so here's a group of people to where the conversation is much different, because instead of now having to go in and say these things, they're actually educating me to what's the best way, again, as I said earlier, right? To kind of do something that's human-centered first, and not just like while you use my app. I think that's what I appreciate. It's more of like, how did you improve the quality of life for this person when they're no longer even engaged with what you've developed?
Right. So for those of you who are familiar with the GDPR and how Europe has dealt with data collection, they have been much more proactive than the US. And one of our board members, Britton Heller, when I have a question that I'm not sure how to address, I go to Britton because she's a law and policy expert and focused on these questions at Stanford. And she knows the writers of the GDPR who can help bring that aspect of a policy forward. So coming into the Guild, coming into Ask Tough Questions together, together. We do that in a monthly Zoom. We do that on Discord. We do that in public-facing events, meetups. We go to each other's offices and hang out and try each other's technology just to see how it works, but also to build community, because the best support system we can create for each other is ourselves. Along the way, we are still human beings, and we're trying to design for other human beings here. So we're a volunteer organization, and I'm just going to reiterate, we're trying to build a handful of programs around mentorship, the Guild Library, but also thinking about audio and video resources like audio events on LinkedIn, video casts, things that bring topical conversations to the front. So if that's something you want to partner with us on, we are currently looking for video editors, people who want to work with us as producers and content creators. And we're also looking at the relationship of content creators in AR, VR, and XR, specifically because there are a whole set of considerations when you are creating, for example, WebXR immersive theater that might be the same conversations you're having around consent, but might be different as well. So we're going to dive just a little bit over here, and we're going to have a moment for questions as well. So if you're holding on to a specific question, we're going to invite you up to the mic in just a few minutes. But as we're thinking about how we take these ideas forward, XR Guild as an organization started here 2 years ago. We did a panel last year that started a conversation, and we formed an organization, but we're still a volunteer organization that is now roughly 200 plus professionals with generally somewhere between 15, 25, 30 years experience in this industry. We recognize that there are hundreds of people here who need that resource, and we want to be able to provide better mentorship matching, perhaps with many of you involved as well. So as we're moving forward, how do we do this work together better? How do we stay in inquiry together better? And what do you think we need? What's missing for us to be able to have that conversation together in public in safe ways? I know. It's a big one, and anyone can take it. I'm just throwing softballs today, right?
Well, I guess I'll just go very quickly. I would say, kind of like what Dana said. I mean, like, number one, you need a safe space to have hard conversations. I think that's one thing I've noticed with a lot of stuff, right? Is to her point. You know, sometimes people feel, if I voice this, how well will it be received? Will this somehow be misinterpreted as a representation of my employer? You know, there's a variety of things. So just very quickly, I think it is very important to say, where is kind of that Highlander holy ground? Where's that safe space I can go to have these conversations where my intentions are to learn, not to, you know, insult, not to, you know, offend, but really just educate. And that actually is much harder than it sounds. Usually people think, oh, we can just bring people together and everyone kind of thinks a certain way. But I definitely think facilitating that safe space to what you said.
And the XR Guild meetups are part of that in order to create a safe space where people can sort of test out these ideas and ask people, how has this been received when you brought these issues up, and maybe find ways to bring them up in a way that's more palatable and doesn't get people in a defensive state, because it is really, we're all trying to do good things, we're all trying to help each other, and so bringing that up in those spaces can be good. And nobody needs to be a super expert, like even on the GDPR is a good example. From an ethical standpoint, we don't need to know all of the rules. What we need to know is why the rules are there. And then from that, we can make up our own rules that apply to the specific situations that we're in. And in that case, the GDPR is really about people's privacy and their ability to be forgotten. Those kind of broad notions are the kinds of things that we can have discussions about, help spread that information. And then if somebody does need to know the intricacies, they can go to somebody like Britton and say, okay, but what about this? But before we get there, just understanding that why these things are in place so that we can start to ask those right questions is the best way to start.
When we get together. That happens in many different cities. That happens in the Bay Area, but that's also in New York, LA, Germany. It can happen anywhere 3 of you decide to get together at some place. We are an open membership organization. There is no fee to join. However, if you donate $100, and the first person who does that today will get this backpack. So I will say, if you are that person, please raise your hand and let me know that you have gone to donate.xrguild.org and you put in $100 and you can take this backpack home today. So we are a nonprofit organization and we are all here because we decided to be here together to support each other, because otherwise we do see each other sort of falling down and stumbling as we try new things with hard technology in public places that are rapidly changing the rules about what is appropriate in a public space. So we've talked over the last few months now, year of events, about topics like generative AI work within our field. We've talked about data collection. We've also talked about, when you're in a headset, all of that data, who gets access to that? And what are the existential risks of those things? As we're thinking ahead about the sort of swords to plows approach, I want you to think sort of practically about how we can support each other. What is it that you, and this is a question for all of you here, I want you to feel free to come up to the mic after this and tell us, what is it that would help you do your work better? Whether you are a creator, a producer, a technologist, an engineer, a researcher, whatever it is, what is it that you are currently lacking that is holding you back from doing your best work? Is it an inability to talk about it because you work in defense industry or something that has to be private, like entertainment? Entertainment has stricter rules about privacy than defense does. So for those of us who've been in that space, it can be extremely tricky to have a conversation with a major company about hard things like 9-year-old safety at the end of the day. So what is it that's currently missing for you? And then this is a question for the rest of you that I want to open up for this conversation. What is it that would help you do your work better at this stage?
For myself, I am really looking forward to this library of resources because I find myself oftentimes trying to search online for maybe tips or tools I can take with me into these hard conversations. So I'm trying to find strategies of how to best effectively do it, especially going back to the fact that I am sometimes a minority in these conversations. Having somebody who is similar to me, who's had to approach these conversations and maybe in an environment where they didn't feel safe to do it, but still knew they had to do it, kind of a scenario would be really helpful for me, just to be able to have some type of, at least a guide of how to go about it. I think that oftentimes there's a lot of, I speak at a lot of universities and all sorts of places, and I have students that come up to me oftentimes and they want me to have all the answers, and I don't, I frankly just don't, and I'm trying to figure this all out as I go. But to have a collective think tank of resources would really be an easy way for me to get access and hopefully support, but then also to point the younger generation towards something that can guide them in their process, because unfortunately, I wish I could be there with them through all those hard conversations and in the room with them as they're having them, but that's just not going to happen. So finding ways to support each other in a asymmetrical kind of way, I think might be something that could be helpful, at least for me.
Absolutely. And I think as we would love to have better support from platform providers in terms of providing more information and more granular requirements. Like, for example, when you have a mobile app that needs to do AR, it needs access to your camera. So the Android or iOS will just say, can I have access to your camera? Well, that's a big question. What do you want to do with that? And so there are good examples of applications that go a little bit further, since the platform doesn't, and says, this is what we need your camera for, this is what we're going to use it for, and this is what we aren't going to use it for. And so seeing examples of that, having people share those examples is really helpful, because it's not always clear the best way to present that. There's all sorts of UX considerations. That's a lot of extra things for people to click on, so you want it to be succinct, but it also needs to be clear about what it is you're asking people to do. And so seeing examples of how other people have approached that problem is super helpful. And so I think we can both talk to those platforms and say, please give us a little bit more granularity, but also in the meantime, we can look to how others are doing it to take a good step forward.
I'm finding in my own work that there is often a missing language of consent that immersive theater people have a better language for than most of the AR or certainly the AI and generative industry have. And so I'm constantly pulling into my immersive theater friends to say, how do you approach this sort of fundamental problem of interactivity around consent before you take people through something that could be transformative or life-changing? This is something I think we all need to grow in and need to learn how to do better. So within XR Guild, we are forming like one-pager documents. Avi is our board president who spoke on Wednesday. Avi Barzev has been focused on the hardware side, the sensor side of AR, VR, and XR. But what we're noticing is that creators also need not just a checklist, but questions to ask and language that helps them go back to the producers, go back to the creators and say, we need to make sure that this check button is here so that there is a clear, transparent transmission of what's happening here. We've had an agreement, an alignment, instead of us making assumptions that maybe aren't appropriate for a wide variety of audiences. So we have about 14 minutes left. There is a mic right there, and I would love to invite anyone who wants to jump in, and I see a great person jumping in right now. Feel free to jump in. Hi.
Hi, and thank you for your time for presenting and taking this time to share with us. I have a question I think is of note, and if you could just expound on and express more, that we look at the Guild and other similar organizations, but not too many, and they're far and few between. Could you express onto why there's a Guild in the first place and the necessity therein, especially in these particular times? Because I know each of you have your own different vertical focuses and things that you've been building on for decades rather, and with what you could do, you've decided to dedicate some of your time that we don't get back towards organizations like the Guild. And given the importance of what each of you individually already do and contribute, you've found the reason to come together. And so can you express the reason as to why there's a Guild in the first place?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think it's really important for me to get help from other people in the community on addressing some of these things, because we can't do it alone. It is very clear that we've seen examples of companies that have tried to set up ethics groups. Those are often some of the first to get laid off when they're downsizing. It's really easy to carve out things like that as potentially unnecessary, but that's dangerous. And really, it's not enough, even if those groups exist, because everybody in the whole process needs to be thinking about these things at some level. We can't wait until the end again. If you have to submit to a board, it's not the same thing. And so from my perspective, it's really important that everybody has some awareness of these issues, and the best way to do that is through an organization like this that is hyper-focused on it. I'm involved in other organizations. Dana and I are in the AIXR, which is another nonprofit focused on XR that is a related organization and certainly a compatible organization, but it's not purely focused on ethics. And so having that focus helps us a little bit to make sure that when we do get together, that's what we're talking about, and keeping those conversations moving forward, because it's not all figured out. We don't have all the answers, and not everybody is doing things in the best way that they could yet.
I think also, like for myself at least, it's been one of these, sometimes I feel really isolated and alone. And that might partly be because I'm located in Salt Lake City. So I am from LA, and there's a lot more of that kind of these types of conversations and people working in VR and AR, and like there's a lot of stuff like that in Los Angeles, right? And I'm used to having communities in Los Angeles that I can kind of like go to or be just kind of in. Somehow I fall into them. But in Salt Lake, I kind of have to seek them out a little bit more. I have to like really make it an intention to find people that help me not feel like I am in asking these questions in this like singular chamber. So that's why I try to be involved in organizations, is because I just, I geographically am in a location that doesn't give me a lot of different opportunities to have just free-flowing conversations. Like I don't go to the bar and like, have these conversations just happen chance in Salt Lake City. That's not happening. So, but I can go other places and find people that I resonate with. And I think that that's what this can give me.
Yeah, and then just quickly, I think, for myself, Chris, is that it's different than other organizations that I've seen, at least personally. The amount of bandwidth is different, right? It's saying, like with these other organizations, usually there's a call to action, there's something that you have to do, there's working groups, there's all these other things. Where the nice thing for the XR Guild for me is it really is like a tribe that I can kind of dip into, say, hey, I'm kind of stuck here, or I don't know about this, and then I can bounce back out. And so the level of actual engagement is very different than if I were like a member of a group that was trying to do policy or something like that.
Yeah. And if you go to xrguild.org, you can check out, for example, the letter and what Avi has been working on in terms of getting people to co-sign on together to say that these issues matter to us as an industry. I found it important to participate in groups like Writers Guild and Producers Guild when I was in Hollywood for that exact reason, so that we could advocate for things together. Next question.
Yep. So I donated. So
Oh, you're the backpacker.
second of all,
Well, maybe other people donated to you.
Uh-oh.
hopefully
I
so.
said the first.
And now you have to clear all your stuff
Yeah.
out.
I know. I just put it there.
That's,
Go ahead.
you got time.
So the question.
I have to make her sign it.
So in my past life, I was in the enforcement industry. And so the standard of ethics pretty much came from a faith-based system. My question to you is twofold. Where does the standard of ethics come from for each of you? And then how is that going to be, I guess, communicated and agreed upon? Or how is that going to be set in this industry? And I'll give you the context of what I'm thinking about. Inside of some of the Facebook meetups, there's some really dark places. And I mean, I work with human trafficking awareness, and I look at, there's a lot of stuff that's done that we used to use that for cases to actually go after people because it's bad. And obviously that seems unethical, but it's not unethical to everybody. And where does that ethics get applied into the XR industry? So it's sort of it's a multifaceted question, but I'd like to hear what your responses are on that.
Wow. My personal take is I'm trained as an interfaith minister. I have a background in religion, and so for myself, I go back to community, and I go back to the places where humans are able to reasonably connect with each other in safer ways. I came into AR/VR XR in part to tell stories of communities that were at risk and marginalized. So I try to flip the camera as much as possible in order to bring that old term, the empathy engine, that sense of empathy as a part of this work. So using the technology to shed a light on exactly what you're describing, which is an atrocious situation that has to be addressed. Avi's got a whole list of specific sort of ethical principles that we choose to abide by. We had a great panel on that last year, and I think there's even a recording of it. we'll let the rest of you speak.
Yeah. So for myself, a lot of my kind of ethical background and standards come honestly from university training. So for my undergrad, I did do a lot of anthropological kind of studies alongside my film and new media work. So that's kind of where it came from originally. And then in my 2 master's degrees, it was a continuation of some of that, but also looking at it from the user experience and the user, like UX and UR kind of side of things too, from the game development standards. So it's based in academia for the most part. That's like where my standards and like my practices come from of application and how I put that into practice. But it also comes like deeper than that for myself, just coming from the streets of Los Angeles and being like this minority who really felt like I wasn't being represented or my stories weren't being told, and how characters, it didn't really resonate with me growing up as a child and playing games and watching films and participating in all these different types of media. And being like an at-risk youth too, I get really nervous when I go into some of these applications, these social applications, and I can clearly hear the voice of a very young child who should not be in that application. I get super, super nervous. And it's almost like I start to kind of hover around because I'm like, get away from them. like I get so protective because I don't know what's going to happen. And you do watch other avatars kind of hovering, and you're like, what's your intention? Who are you? What are you doing? And you get this kind of mother bear scenario going on, because unfortunately, you know that they're not supposed to be there, and it wasn't designed for them, but there's no design keeping them out. And that's where my ethical concern with how we have these dialogues and how we design these spaces to cultivate the types of interactions that we want and want to encourage and prevent some of these really horrific things from happening. Because unfortunately, it's going to take something really horrific probably to happen that other regulators are going to come into our space and then demand change from us and demand us to start thinking about these in more realistic terms. And I'm scared of that, because that means that something bad's going to happen. And I don't want something bad to happen. I want us to be able to be responsible enough on our own to prevent that horrific thing from happening. So that's kind of why I am trying to do whatever I can in this space.
And kids will seek out bad things. Kids will actively seek out bad things. And so you sometimes have to make it harder for them to engage in behaviors that would put them at risk.
Yeah. And for me, it's very deeply ingrained in just how it was raised, but also just in the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. That anything that would inhibit that, anything that's going to make things worse for people is to be avoided. And I think as we look back to before these spaces became immersive, even in text-based MUDs, I ended up being an administrator on a MUD that was an online text-based virtual environment that people spent a lot of time in. And I ended up having to be responsible for dealing with issues of harassment and other problems that would come up in these kinds of online communities. So I saw, this was 30 years ago, seeing what could happen in these relatively small spaces where people come together and bad things do happen and they have to be dealt with. And as we expand these and we get to millions and millions of users in these same spaces in a much more immersive and more tactile in many ways, it's much more real that these things just become more important. And so it's something that we all need to be thinking about.
I just stay unethical. So, cross that bridge when I get there.
And I was going to actually give a shout out to Laura and the great work that XRSI is also doing in this space specifically, because we rely on all the other communities that are focused on child safety, cybersecurity, and all of these other touch points. Go ahead.
Yes, I was going to ask about whether there's going to be a new work product from this. I mean, it sounds like ethical is kind of like secure. You want secure by design. You need to, and it's like anything. If you really want to have it in, you got to look at it from the beginning. Is there a notion of what ethical by design would be, and what would be, and how that would affect one's processes? And do you guys plan on producing anything to help people with that?
we have gone as far as writing grants to fund that work. So if you have allies, partnerships, and global endeavors that are aligned to this, and you can see us working together, please get in touch. Avi Bar-Zav, our board president, would be a great person to speak with about that as well.
Excellent. I really am thankful that you kind of addressed the issue of being a Latina on stage. I'm personally Arab and Mughal, which is Southeast Asian. Yeah, and you also talked about GDPR. So coming from largely the Emirates, we've got a lot of regulations that are going to be affecting this industry pretty heavily. And by 2030, we've got an onboarding of largely the Middle East and North Africa, which is Muslims, Coptic Christians, Orthodox Christians. What kind of thought has the Guild given in terms of the inclusion of these large populations? Largely because, I mean, if one of us walks into one of these conferences, we've increased inclusion by 100%, you know, and nowadays, like, these are huge populations that aren't in these ecosystems, whether it's Web 2, Web 2.5, or Web 3, but they will be, you know, inside of the next couple of years. Like, what kind of thought's been given to that?
I went and spoke in Dubai at the World Government Summit on why we need an open metaverse and an open space for everyone to engage. But in that conversation, I spoke to many women specifically in Dubai and tried to understand what they need in order to feel safe in these spaces, because many of them were not feeling like they were allowed to engage, right? This sense of that the internet and the 3D web was for the sheikhs, but not for the women, was a concern that I was hitting over and over again. But in general, how does the XR Guild approach the broader international movement? We would love to invite in all of our colleagues from all over the world. I currently engage with a small number of friends, mostly in UAE, but I know Avi is on the board of Magic Leap in Saudi Arabia, and figuring out how to include our professionals across the globe is important. How do you think we could do this better, I think, is the question I would want to ask you, because there is a huge gap to fill here.
Yeah, I mean, folks like myself, you know, I bridge the gap in between two worlds, right? You know, because I'm born and raised American, but, you know, I go back there. I mean, I have family in like 3 different countries. You know, I think a lot of this could be like leveraging folks like us to be the bridge. I mean, because you from Latino communities, like, you know, you have to be the bridge half the time. And then the second thing I think is it's understanding the differences. I think what we're going to have is multiple sets of cultural mores, right? Because the world's a very big place. And I think it's going back to mutual respect and really imbuing mutual respect inside of that. Not everyone's going to agree on everything. But as long as we can agree to disagree on the things that we disagree about and do that in a way where it's collegial, you know, I think that could be a huge solution.
I think you're right. And I want to encourage all of you to come and participate in these conversations and help us do this work better. So thank you, Oz, for that. Joining on Discord is a great way to start that conversation. So if something lit up for you today in this conversation, we're wrapping now, but just want to thank you for that point of inquiry that we can take back to the board, to the community. We do regular Zoom meetings every month. You're welcome to participate, and you can join us at xrguild.org. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And come get your backpack.